Hello, BookTube. Welcome to this live stream. The live stream is going to be slightly different from the one which was initially planned. If you were here last week for my live stream with Stephen Stoppard, I mentioned the fact that I was going to do a live stream discussion with my friend Sean Dean Stanfast on the Heart of Darkness. However, that was we were unable to do that, and so fortunately, I've been able to find that's going to be pushed back to Thursday. However, I've been able to come up with a topic to do a live stream tonight, which is on, as the title of the live stream suggests, what if Southern Rhodesia joined South Africa in 1922? And I'll be joined in this by a gentleman called Charlton Cussans. Cussans, I believe that's how his name is pronounced. He will be joining us in a few minutes' time, and he is a teaching fellow at Coventry University, and who specialises in British Southern African history, and he's also written books and a couple of short stories for Sealion Press, which is the UK's foremost alternate history publisher. One of his second book, let me just get the title for that, which is actually one of the things that inspired me to ask him to do this was, let me just get it. It's called Our Free and Happy Land, which is an alternate history that asks the question of how would South Africa have developed if the National Party had not won the 1948 general election and brought in apartheid. And so it's going to be interesting to hear Charlton's view of things, because he obviously, being a specialist in this, in sort of British Southern Africa, he has a he's a store of knowledge on the issue, and it's going to be interesting to see how he believes these things would have developed, especially given the sort of not just the racial differences you have in Southern Africa between whites and blacks, but also between the ethnic differences within sort of the intra-racial differences of ethnicity between the British or Anglophone South Africans and Southern Rhodesians compared to the Afrikaner South Africans, as well as elements of gender, particularly the role of women within the politics of the era, particularly when we get onto this historical background of the 1922 referendum, where if you look in the description, there's an article that Charlton has written, and he discusses in that about the referendum, and he discusses the role of women there, which is something I wasn't aware of. In fact, I would recommend anybody who after the stream wants to know a bit more detail about the 1922 referendum, do read that article, because it is really well detailed and gives you a good understanding of the sort of underlying concerns of the Southern Rhodesians, who were very Anglophone, regarding themselves as very British, and how they view South Africa, which for a lot of people, I would imagine the view of South Africa that they have is one that will be unusual for the sort of general history audience to have. By which I mean it would be sort of the ethnic differences between these sort of Anglophone British Africans, as it were, and the Afrikaners was quite distinct, and that South Africa was viewed as with a great deal of suspicion because of the Afrikaner presence. Let me just go through the chat. So, hello Timothy, thank you for joining us. As I say, Charlton will be joining us shortly, but just whilst we're waiting, I will just get up a map so that we have a sort of general idea. So, as you can see, this is a map of colonial Africa. This was 1950. Obviously, sometime after this will be. Sorry, this is from 1950, but this is generally what the borders of particularly Southern Africa look like in 1922. So, as you can see here, South Africa, we've got Lesotho and Swaziland down the red the very dark pink bits within South Africa, they are British protectorates. Just north west of South Africa is what was during World War One, before World War One, German Southwest Africa, what is now Namibia, what at the time was called Southwest Africa, which had been given to South Africa as a League of Nations mandate. And then above here, we have directly above South Africa, we have Bechuanaland, what is now Botswana, which is a British protectorate. And then, well, most importantly for this discussion, we have Southern Rhodesia, which is there. And Charlton has just joined us, so if you just bear a second, I'll bring you onto the stage. Hello, Charlton.
Hello, good evening, everyone.
Thank you. So I've just given a sort of general idea of what we're going to be discussing. And I'll just give them a bit of an idea about the geography. I should say this map, I say it's from 1950, but it's got the borders of particularly Southern Africa between 1922 and 1950 don't really change much in general terms.
No, and this is just before winds of change, just before decolonisation. So the borders that you see here are mostly the same since 1910 and the unification of South Africa.
Yeah. So to sort of begin the discussion, I think if we give a bit of a potted history of the formation of, say, South Africa and then the Southern and Northern Rhodesia, just generally. So South Africa, as a colonial venture, begins with the Dutch in 1600, and they
I believe, if I recall off the top of my head, the Dutch Cape was founded in 1652. So that marks before the Dutch arrived in the Cape. The Cape was first discovered by Europeans, by Vasco da Gama, the great Portuguese explorer, I guess imperialist, you could say, who rounded the Cape on his way to India. I'm not sure why the Portuguese didn't ever set up any sort of colony in the Cape. It is, even I'm no marine expert or geographer, but even my eyes can tell you that the Cape would be a fantastic place to set up a naval base. The Portuguese never did so, although they did lay claim to it. They never did anything practical with it. And then the Dutch were the first to do anything practical with it, starting in 1652. And what became the Dutch Cape Colony, or the Kaapkolonie in Dutch, was administered by the Dutch East Indies Company.
Yeah, and they control the Cape up until the 1790s. I believe is it 1797 when the British, or 1798. It's late 1790s when the French Revolutionary Government invade the Netherlands, and they establish the Batavian Republic. And then,
so in 1795, the British take the colony from the Dutch East India Company. In 1803, it is given back to the Batavian Republic, but in 1806, the British take it again after the Batavian Republic allies itself. I say allies; it becomes a vassal of the Napoleonic Empire. So what you've got, the period of Batavian rule of the colony really shakes things up, because for about 150 years under the rule of the East India Company, the Dutch Cape Colony had evolved as what one historian described as a multi-ethnic, pluralistic society, nonetheless ruled by white Europeans. And a couple of notable things emerge over this period. Firstly, despite the fact that the Cape is one of the few areas of Africa where mass European settlement was possible before modern medicine, mass European migration to the Cape did not occur. What did occur was you ended up with a lot of former employees of the Dutch East India Company being given land in the Cape in lieu of cash pensions. So the white population there is heavily tilted towards elder men, which, because of the gender deficits, you start seeing a lot of mixed race couples, coercive and non-coercive, I think would be the politest way of putting it.
Yeah.
So you start not seeing not just white Dutch speakers, but also mixed race Dutch speakers. The proto examples of what we now call the coloured community. The second thing that happens is, even though it is on a small scale, the settler population of the Dutch Cape does grow, and particularly towards the end of the 18th century, during the French Revolution, you start seeing conflict between what were known as the burghers, the free Dutch settlers of the colony, and the East India Company. And then you also start seeing, during the Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, conflict between the Batavian Republic, which starts making a lot of centralizing reforms, both domestically and in the Dutch colonies, and the settlers.
Yeah.
Reforms to tax, reforms to land ownership. Basically, if any of people watching, listening know about the build-up to the American Revolution, it's same sort of arguments going there. Distant metropolitan government making what colonists see as interference in their lives and businesses.
Yeah. And I will just mention one slight thing. Is that whilst there are which is obviously the majority of those settled there are Dutch, there are also French Huguenots who go there.
Yes, and I think, again, the important point to emphasise, we say the Dutch Cape Colony, a lot of people who ended up there were Flemish Protestants, and you start seeing the origins of a distinct African Dutch community that would become, over the 19th century, the Afrikaners.
Yeah.
And then in 1806, after everything, the Netherlands finally cedes the Dutch Cape, becomes the British Cape Colony.
Yeah.
And so over the course of for a few years, nothing really changes, but then two things start happening. First, the British abolish slavery in the British Empire. The second is large-scale British migration starts happening to the Cape. And in 1820 marks the first large-scale settlement of the Cape, particularly in the Eastern Cape, what is now the Eastern Cape, further along the coast.
Yeah.
So you end up with things, the establishment of, so for example, Port Elizabeth, modern Gekburger. They still call it Port Elizabeth mostly.
Yeah.
By Anglophone, well, English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish settlers.
Yeah.
And this, sorry.
No, please go on.
And eventually you end up with these two things combined. Again, the sort of centralizing reforms that the British do in this period. You end up with a split in the Dutch community in the Cape between those who acclimatise to British rule, generally historically referred to as variously Cape Afrikaners, or but more broadly Crown Afrikaners, and then famously the ones who decide to move into the interior of Southern Africa are the Boers, the farmers. That's literally what Boer means is farmer. and the Boers start to migrate into the interior to set up their own states, polities, independent republics. And I think it's two things are important to note here. That this great trek, this migration from 1836 onwards over the course of the mid-19th century creates a new kind of political identity amongst the settlers of the interior, and also like massively shakes things up for the indigenous Black African nations and kingdoms and statelets in the area, in the way that the more limited Dutch and British colonial rule, which have mostly been focused along the coast, had not.
And one thing that should be mentioned is as the world trekkers are going into the interior, the indigenous African tribes are themselves going through a period of quite violent change, what's called the Macafe, the series of wars at the time, particularly the Zulus are going prominent at that point.
Yeah, so Shaka Zulu basically had thrown the entire region into upheaval a few years before the Vortrek started. And so you basically end up with an interesting sort of situation whereby, as I always explain to people, everyone ends up everywhere.
Yeah.
And so you have non-contiguous, non-continuous areas of dense population, less dense population, and you end up with ethnic, national, proto-political borders at this point that do not really follow any sort of neat lines or divisions.
Yeah.
And one thing that I think I must emphasize is that the Boer communities, the Boer republics, as they're called in the historiography, are not. They're not European states. They're barely even colonial states. The Cape Colony is a recognizable government, laws, economy, assemblies, etc., etc., etc. The Boer republics at this point are barely distinguishable. Well, they are basically tribal polities.
Yeah.
Just white and speaking Proto-Afrikaans.
Yeah.
And the chaos this all unleashes and the violence leads the British, who in I can't remember the date in the town.
I think it's 1842, 39,
43.
43.
So one of the Boer republics that established is something called the Natalia Republic in 1839, and then the British annexed that in 1843. So again, over the course of the mid 19th century, clashes and consolidation. So by the 1870s, hang on, what was the date of it? So by 1880, you have the British Cape Colony, the British colony of Natal, the Orange Free State, and the Transvaal Republic. Now, what happens? The Orange Free State and the Transvaal, particularly the Transvaal or South African Republic, have sort of solidified, consolidated their smaller Boer Republic neighbours, set up these sort of theo-democratic Herrenvolk democracies by and for white Afrikaner Dutch Reformed Church speaking worshipping men. And they call themselves these republics, but these are very sparsely organized. And I think when we think of republic, do not think of an Enlightenment republic, such as, well, the French. These are pre-Enlightenment republics. Think medieval Hanseatic League in the Southern African interior. And eventually the British, kind of complicated to explain, but the British end up controlling these governments for a few years.
Yeah.
And bringing a whole host of like new technologies, innovations, etc., etc., etc. Eventually, the British start planning to amalgamate, federate the Natal, the Orange Free State, the Transvaal, and the British Cape Colony. The Transvaal rebels against this and reasserts itself as an independent republic free of British sovereignty, and the British withdraw. While all this is going on, you have, of course, wider events in the British Empire, the world. You have the Indian Mutiny, the Indian Rebellion, leads to the end of British East India Company rule, the establishment of the Raj, the ongoing British colonization of Australia, British colonization of Canada, the Americans pushing westward, Manifest Destiny, etc., etc., etc. So, wars of empire, imperial expansion, imperial reform are commonplace. In South Africa, you start seeing the growing tension starts being particularly noticeable in the Cape. What should the relationship be? And this sets up the two questions that are fundamental to the question posed: what if Southern Rhodesia joined in South Africa in 1922? Is what should the relationship be between the ethnicities, peoples, nations, communities within South Africa, or the Cape, etc., etc.? And secondly, what should South Africa's as a whole relationship be to Britain and to the Empire?
Yeah.
And so you had the First Boer War, which, by the way, interesting point, the Boer marksmanship and sharpshooting skills led to Britain abandoning the red coat. This was the last war in which British soldiers wore the red coat. And afterwards,
sorry, go on.
And afterwards, they start wearing khaki.
Yeah, and what one thing I will just add is that with the Transvaal, they in the late 1860s, throughout the 1870s, are in a state. They have a civil war. They have economic difficulties, and that leads to the British control in 1877. Just as a side point, but for my channel, I do book reviews, and when Theosophus Stevenson, I think that's the commissioner, he goes into the Transvaal and he has the British Union Jack put up. The man who puts the Union Jack up is H. Rider Haggard, the author of King Solomon's Mines.
Oh, I did not know that. That's fantastic.
He does that, and he's actually in the Transvaal throughout that period. I think just before the Zulu War, which viewers of my channel will know because I'm a great fan of the film Zulu, which depicts obviously the Battle of Rorke's Drift, and a slight depiction of the aftermath of Isandlwana.
Yeah, and this is something really important to consider: is you have conflicts between the Boers and the British.
Yeah.
Also between the Boers and the Zulu, the British and the Zulu. And like there are people in the Cape saying like we should ally with like loyal natives against the Boers. There are people who say no, we need white solidarity against the Africans. And that was Cecil Rhodes's project. And Cecil Rhodes starts emerging at the end of the 19th century. There are two big major events that happen in Southern Africa in the 1780s and in 1871. There's the Kimberley Diamond Rush. and this floods of immigrants to the Cape Colony. Cecil Rhodes has migrated there when he was young for his health. He makes his fortune selling equipment, basically. It's the old joke that in a gold rush sell pickaxes. He does that, makes his fortune, and then uses that fortune to set up De Beers, the famous diamond corporation.
Yeah. Well, essentially, it was from when he sets it up pretty much up until, I think, is it the 1960s or 70s? It's pretty much a monopoly close to a monopoly on the diamond mines at Kimberley. Similar, something close, am I right?
Yeah, Cecil Rhodes, imperialist, hero of the British Empire, almost certainly a homosexual. Like, he a worldview that he was deeply racist, like, and his idea of how the world should be organised was that white Anglophones, well, be they British or American, but mostly British, would rule the world. And every other sort of white community, Afrikaners, Dutch, German, should be taken on for the ride, but white British people should be in charge of it. And he starts to become really influential in the Cape in the latter quarter of the 19th century, pardon me. And he has a few projects, like big ideas. Firstly, a unification of all the white-run politities in Southern Africa.
Yeah.
So by this point, after the First World War, Cape Colony, Natal Colony, Orange Free State, Transvaal Republic. Secondly, the removal of Black, African, and coloured voters from the franchise in the Cape. Because up until this point, the Cape has had something called, well, I say up until this point, it continues to have something called the Cape Qualified Franchise. Cecil Rhodes starts raising the requirements to vote. Over this period, and also like removing methods whereby such collective land ownership rights, which meant that Black Africans who wouldn't have the vote actually did have the right to vote.
Yeah.
And his other project, which we will get to this eventually, is increasing British influence north of the Limpopo River in what is now Zimbabwe and Zambia. So, which brings us on to, I think, one of the most important events in world history that nobody ever really reads about unless you're subject matter empire, the Witwatersrand Gold Rush.
Yes.
1886, gold is found on the Witwatersrand in, well, I say in what is now Johannesburg. Johannesburg was established because of the Witwatersrand Gold Rush. It's built on top of the gold mine, basically.
Yeah.
And this leads a massive influx of migrants, British, German, Dutch, Americans, Australians, and interesting fact in terms of historiography, the fact that whenever there's a gold rush, massive numbers of white British people end up wherever the gold is found, has been noted by historians. They're called Anglo booms. happens in the Witwatersrand, happens in California, happens in Australia.
Yeah.
Massive numbers of people go to mine, and then people like providing business opportunities, whatever, for the miners. And the same happens in the Transvaal. And so in the Transvaal over the late 1880s, 1890s, well, basically this sort of like reformed but still quite archaic Heaven-Volk fair democracy set up by the Boers starts to creak and crack under the pressure.
Mm.
The idea that you must be a property-owning Afrikaner, well, proto-Afrikaner at this point, really, Afrikaans-speaking man who's a member of the Dutch Reformed Church, when all these English speakers, from non-Afrikaans speakers who don't own any property but expect voting rights come in. They start getting called the Uitlanders, the Outlanders. So that's one issue in the Republic itself. And to a lesser extent, the Orange Free State, which doesn't have the same degree of, doesn't have this migration boom as the Transvaal.
Yeah.
But it's affected by sort of like the wider repercussions of this. This again causes, beyond the internal effects in the Transvaal, this causes two major external effects. The first is local, in that Cecil Rhodes thinks, right, we can't allow the Boers in the Transvaal to control this exclusively. We need to have like a purely British gold rush, where in the region has gold that hasn't been like taken over by the Boers or by the Portuguese or Belgians.
Yeah.
And he looks north of the Limpopo and sees the kingdom of Lobengula. Put a pin in that for one moment. So that's one thing. The next thing, the other thing that happens is in London, there's a great and growing fear that the Orange Free State, Transvaal, Cape and Natal will unify as an Uitlander republic, a United States of South Africa outside of the British Empire. Because what people in London want, most people in London at this point want a unified South Africa, but they want it to remain in the British Empire.
Yeah.
And again, it all comes back to what is the relationship between the communities in South Africa, what is the relationship of South Africa to London. And so at this point, you have people like black community leaders in the Cape saying, like, okay, yeah, sure, we can have a unified South Africa, but you must extend the Cape qualified franchise to the black people in the Transvaal, Natal, and Orange Free State. There are people saying, yeah, we can have a unified South Africa, must be in the British Empire, that only white people can have the vote. There are Boer leaders, like Paul Kruger, for example, saying, no, Transvaal must remain independent and like the Boers must remain in charge of it.
Yeah.
And so this is all happening over 1886 onwards. In 1890, finally, the pioneer column sets out. And, well, firstly, they set out for what is now Southern Rhodesia and establish a place called Fort Salisbury. It's a couple of thousand, about, I think it might be less than that. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head. Yes. Yeah. The photo exactly. One thing you'll note, all the guys in that were white. The pioneer column was not an exclusively white affair. Alongside the white pioneers were about an equal number of coloured people from the coloured community and about twice their number of native porters. Servants, little different from slaves in practice. And the reason, and in 1890, the pioneer column raises the flag on a hill in the north of what is now Zimbabwe, establishes Fort Salisbury after the British Prime Minister at the time, Robert Cecil, who was the Marquis of Salisbury, I should say.
Yeah, we'll just say that. Oh, sorry, just to point out, if you want to know what Lord Salisbury looked like, just look at my profile picture, because that's the chap.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and they claim, and here's where things get complicated, because the legal reason the British South Africa Company, which was the group these people working for, part of, however you want to put it, was able to do this, was that the king of the territory, a man called Lobengula, had signed a treaty with a man called Leander Sar Jameson. Now, Lobengula was king of a people called the Northern Ndebele people, and they were sort of a faction, descendants of a faction of the Zulus, and they'd sort of set up this kingdom after Shaka Zulu did his thing. And in the 1830s, they claimed like sort of a sort of feudal dominion over the pre-existing Shona people, I think they were, of that part of Zimbabwe. Again, like we say, people, they mix and match, and a lot of these sort of like clear tribal people distinctions are the result of Europeans coming and naming them.
Yeah,
that's something very important to consider. And Lobengula, basically, people in Zimbabwe had known about Europeans for centuries. They knew that they had guns. They knew they were looking for gold. So Lobengula was like, right, I'm going to sign this treaty with Leander Sar Jameson, who was Cecil Rhodes' man on the ground. He was a Lobengula was a Scotsman. No, sorry. Leander Sar Jameson was a Scotsman by birth, a doctor by training, and an imperialist pirate by choice.
Yeah.
Lobengula, he signed a contract with Leander Sar Jameson saying, right, in return for guns and diplomatic protection, I will allow white people to come to my country to look for gold, basically.
Yeah.
At least that's what he thinks it says. What the treaty actually says is that I basically give my entire territory over to the British South Africa Company. He'd been conned.
Mm.
And so in an act of con artistry, the British South Africa Company start encroaching on Lobengula's kingdom and upon his territory. And so from 1890 to 1893, you sort of have this tense standoff between the growing company territory and the forces of Lobengula, with Cecil, like Leander Sar Jameson, being the man on the ground. And Lobengula musters his warriors. Misconception that Lobengula had full country of most of the territory. Again, he definitely controlled a large chunk of the territory of what is now Zimbabwe. I think it would be a misnomer to say he controlled the entire territory, unless I'm misreading you. Maybe we're agreeing. I'm not. I'm just checking the chat comments.
Oh yeah, I'll just bring that up so people can see. Yeah,
misconception that I was trying to clarify from my point of view of like what Lobengula had control of in terms of territory. Most of northern Zimbabwe is what I would say he controlled.
Okay. Just just bring this up. This is about the Shangani for just for people who want to know. This is a significant event in what the Charlton's about to come through, the First Matabeli War, as it was described.
Yeah. And basically there was a conflict basically over sovereignty, and 1893 this all breaks out. The company forces are outnumbered, but vastly outnumbered, but they have machine guns and they have light field artillery.
Yeah.
And it's basically a massacre.
Yeah, I mean this is where you get the famous Hilaire Belloc line of about we will win. We have Maxim guns and they have not.
Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not.
Yeah.
They the Zulu, not Zulu, they fought like Zulus.
Yeah.
The Ndebele forces had rifles, but they didn't have machine guns, didn't have artillery.
Yeah.
And so Lobengula died of smallpox a year later, and the territory is consolidated under company rule, with Leander Starr Jameson once again sort of Rhodes man on the ground. And for the next 3 years, things start. I say calm down. There's no fighting for the next 3 years. The company continues. There's trickle of immigration, farms that are panning for gold. They find gold, nowhere near as much as they want. And you also start seeing settlers move north of the Zambezi River on the northern border, further into Central Africa, into Northern Rhodesia. Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia end up taking quite distinct paths. Southern Rhodesia has large areas capable of sustaining European population. Northern Rhodesia only has some areas. Also, it's a lot further away from the coast, a lot more difficult to build train lines. So, and at this point in history, I say Southern Rhodesia doesn't have that much gold. It still does have gold and other resources, also incredibly fertile farming country.
Yeah.
So Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia start to already diverge economically. And with Leander Starr Jameson, Leander Starr Jameson is one of the vilest figures that came up in like my research for my PhD, like in the earliest history of Southern Rhodesia and the colony. The Kipling poem "If" is about Leander Starr Jameson. You'll be a man, my son, all that sort of stuff. The thing about Jameson is, as far as I can tell, he was a psychopath.
Right.
I feel I'm loath to diagnose someone more than a century removed, but he didn't really seem to give a damn about anyone else.
Mm.
And the regime he established in Southern Rhodesia for those first few years, it's difficult to get an accurate read on it because they didn't really record it, but the level of sexual violence against Indigenous women, theft, murder were extreme in those first few years. And eventually this all leads to the Second Matabeli War. Which breaks out in 1896.
We should just say that as the war breaks, as the second war breaks out, there's also it's taking place just after the Rinderpest, which has affected cattle in the region.
Yes, and it's also
the Jameson Raid. I was
just about to say, where basically a bunch of the white military forces of Company Rhodesia, I think is the best way to put it at this point, basically try and take over, basically do a filibuster in the Transvaal. And it's led by Jameson. It's badly thought out in theory and badly executed in practice. And it's a huge embarrassment. Cecil Rhodes has to resign as Prime Minister of the Cape. And basically the Company of Rhodesia stripped of its defence forces. And because of all the abuses, the country promptly explodes in sort of ethnic. It's like half a religious rebellion, half an ethnic rebellion, half a war of independence. My maths might be wrong now. I'm not good at fractions. And it's a brutal, bloody affair. The company forces eventually win, but you end up, well, first of all, Baden-Powell, the founder of the British Scouting movement, sort of gets his first experience of scouting and patrolling in the rebellion, in the war. And you also get the sort of the regime of basically terror that Jameson has established starts to wind down.
Yeah.
And a more sort of orderly colonial system is best. Well, it's not pleasant, but it's less actively criminal.
Yeah.
Than Jameson's regime is established. Also, further distrust between the Boers and the Anglos because of the Jameson Raid. And so you've basically had decades of outbreaks of chaos across the whole region since about 1870. Now, this really escalates in 1899 when the Boer War establishes. Boer militias from the Orange Free State and South African Republic, that is Transvaal Republic, attack the British in the Eastern Cape. And what was meant to be this sort of like small-scale colonial war blows massively out of proportion, lasts almost 3 years. Troops from all over the empire get involved. Hundreds of thousands of British and hundreds of thousands of colonial troops from Australia, Canada, not to mention hundreds of thousands of Black Africans get involved, all to crush less than 50,000 total Boers.
Yeah.
And it's a war with vast repercussions. The British use concentration camps and scorched earth tactics to break the Boers. The ill health of British recruits, and compared to the good health of colonial troops from South Africa and from Canada and Australia, sparks a wave of like discourse in Britain that leads to the establishment of like national insurance, for example. We have national insurance in the UK because of the Second Boer War.
Yeah, but just to go on that, a lot of the very much the from period of 1908 to 1911, things like national insurance and the other old age pension, other elements of these liberal reforms established a welfare state take place at that time.
Yes, but partially because of like domestic investigations, such as the Roundtree Report, but also because of the practical evidence that British people are just unhealthy.
Yeah.
And they need state intervention to make them healthy so we can fight wars, basically. And eventually numbers do tell, numbers and British brutality. Thousands of Boers die in the camps. Thing is, and so this leads...
Oh, sorry. Charlton's disappeared. Just bear with a second. Just double check if he's gone. Oh, he's back. Okay.
The one bloody button there.
I just have to mention one point about the concentration camps. The death toll there was as much due to mismanagement as it was to intentional
cruelty.
Intentional cruelty, because you had an army which didn't necessarily know how to deal with a civilian population in that way, in a way that the modern British Army, for example, would. But it's obviously had the experience of having to deal with things like this before, whereas the old mercenary army that Kipling describes in his works really wasn't used to using that sort of dealing with this situation at all.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about atrocities like this, and the concentration camps were an atrocity, the point between deliberate cruelty and the neglectful cruelty starts becoming a bit, well, academic, frankly, in my view. But however, I think there are also a couple of other. I'm just going to turn my light on. It's getting a bit dark in here.
Yeah, well, that's fine. Absolutely, yeah. One thing I will mention, just whilst Charlton's off, is that he mentioned it having repercussions. One of the immediate repercussions was that it was a big event discussed in the 1900 general election, so much so that is called the Khaki election. And it's very much the Conservatives, well, the Unionists, who are a coalition of the Conservatives and the Liberal Unionists, campaign on very much on that as an election to win the war. And Joseph Chamberlain, the Colonial Secretary, father of Neville Chamberlain, the future Prime Minister, is very much prominent in that. He was very much that he was involved at I believe at the sort of the indirectly in the Jameson Raid, in the sense that he knew what was going on, but he didn't officially. I mean, with Chamberlain, it's his exact role in Jameson Raid isn't entirely direct.
Yeah.
He knew what was going on. If I'm right in
one of the things we'll talk about later in the live stream is the sort of deliberate inability of the Metropolitan government to actually control colonial actors.
Yeah.
The thing is, there's so much build-up needed to get us to the main topic of this question, of this live stream. A couple of things to note. In a British perspective, one thing that the camps lead to, actually leads to a lot more civilian, direct, deliberate parliamentary oversight of the army.
Yeah.
And sort of solidifies parliamentary civilian control and oversight of the army on the grand strategic level. Second thing is, about the same number of Black Africans die in the camp.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting, and more broadly, the Black Southern African experience in the war gets written out of the history of it deliberately by everyone. Because the third point is, a lot of the narratives of Afrikaner nationalism are born in the camps.
Yeah.
And so you end up, after the war ends in 1902, the Boer Republic surrender, immediately a narrative starts to form of Afrikaner nationalism, which combines the notion that we are the chosen people of God, who left to escape the ungodly British and their ungodly laws in the Voortrek, and they followed us and persecuted us and tormented us. And that we have been chosen by God, white Afrikaans speaking Dutch Reformed Church members, to rule Southern Africa. That's one of the narratives that formed. The other narratives that formed is that South Africa should be unified under sort of an Anglo-Afrikaner co-dominion. There's also a third group of Black intellectual civil rights leaders who say, no, we want our part in the country as well, but they are mostly ignored, sadly. So in 1902, the war ends, and you end up with the region divided into 4 colonies. South of the Limpopo River, you have the Orange River Colony, the Transvaal Colony, Natal Colony, the Cape Colony, and next to them you have German Southwest Africa, and north of them you have the Portuguese West and East Africa and Company Rhodesia.
Yeah.
And in only one of these territories do people of colour have any sort of political power, and that's the Cape Colony, and this is starting to fade. So that brings us, and then over the next few years, World War I, 1910, Union of South Africa is created. The 4 colonies there are unified, and they are not federated like they are in Australia in 1901. and they are not confederated like they are in Canada in, I believe, 1867. What happens in South Africa in 1910 is they are unified under a central government. The South Africa Act establishes English and Dutch as the two official languages, co-equal status. Franchise requirements are left to the individual provinces. The Cape keeps its Cape qualified franchise, for whatever it's worth by this point. But Natal technically has a qualified franchise, but it doesn't in practice. And blatantly white supremacist franchise systems are kept in place in Johannesburg, in the Transvaal province and Orange River province, as they are at this point. And north of Limpopo, in what is become Southern Rhodesia, the white English-speaking community there starts to really solidify and gain its identity in the aftermath of the Second Boer War, or the South African War, as it's called in modern historiography, and in the aftermath of World War One. And that leads us at last to the question, an hour in, what if Southern Rhodesia joined South Africa in 1992?
Yeah.
So, back... do you want to say anything at this point, or?
Yeah, I will just say one thing is that just about where in this run up to the South Africa Act, there is also within South Africa. I've got to say, if I got this wrong, please correct me. But there was a considerable opposition from Anglo South Africans over the Liberal government's handling of the reintegration of the two former Boer republics over large-scale sort of British immigration, as it were. That there was have I got that right? Or have I got that wrong?
One of the things that does happen is that, like, the exclusive, like the Boer Republic system that excludes non-English speakers is disbanded.
Yeah.
And again, what happens in 1910 is very much deliberately Anglo-Afrikaner equality.
Yeah.
Above and against everyone else. And in fact, one of the funny things you'll see if you read any of the primary sources from this period, it's constant references to racial equality.
Yeah. Yeah.
They mean between British and Afrikaners.
Yeah. One thing, I'll just mention one other thing. At the time when in the Edwardian period, I do remember there was something that Rudyard Kipling wrote, and it was about that he regarded the Liberal government, particularly with Elgin at the Colonial Office and Churchill, they're being too generous to the Afrikaners. And I remember this because he used the phrase in reference to Black South Africa. He said that if the Boers were discontinued, the Boers would use their crude racial domination over the Africans, which that always stuck with me.
Again, you sort of have who should be in charge of South Africa and why they should be in charge of South Africa, and like are vitally important questions. So Southern Rhodesia does not and never has, even after UDI in the 60s and all that stuff, which we don't think we've got time or space to talk about today. But they do not have a racially exclusive franchise in theory. They have their own version of the Cape qualified franchise. Now, as far as I can tell, in 1922, 10 Black Africans met the qualification to vote in the colony.
Yeah.
And by the 30s, I've got a source somewhere in here. I've got a whole bunch of writing on a whole bunch of things at the moment. About 50 Black Africans have the right to vote. And one thing, just as an aside, one thing that you'll note about Rhodesian history is that whether Black Africans in the colony start getting enough educations and jobs to meet like voting requirements, they either raise the voting requirements or exclude Black Africans from the vote, or exclude Black Africans from jobs jobs and land ownership that will give them the voting requirements.
Yeah.
So, whereas in contrast, in Transvaal and the Orange Free State provinces of South Africa at the time, we are white supremacists, skin colour supremacists, and on that basis, we are denying you the right to vote. And Southern Rhodesians in 1922 contrasted this with their enlightened system.
Yeah.
And a lot of the rhetoric, by the way, the reason South Africa, there was a vote in Southern Rhodesia to join South Africa in 1922 was the British South Africa company was broke.
Yeah.
Could no longer practically administer the colony. The South African Prime Minister at the time, Jan Smuts, fascinating, famous, world historical figure. Exactly. He believed in Anglo-Afrikaner union and unity. He was a Pan-Africanist white supremacist, which is an ideology that does not exist anymore.
Yeah.
frankly, it barely existed when he was alive.
Yeah. We should say he was very much influenced by Cecil Rhodes.
Yeah.
Particularly early on in his career, when he was, didn't he work? If I'm right to say, before the before the Jameson Raid, he actually did work for Rhodes in some.
Yeah, as a young man, he worked for Rhodes, and then he actually fought for the Boer Republics, and then sort of like accepted British rule and sort of like advocated for unification. And his whole thing was a united Anglo-Afrikaner white community within a united, within the British Empire, in turn within the League of Nations. That was his whole grand political project.
And just to go off a bit more on Smuts, after that he, for example, during World War One, is involved in the committee that writes a report that leads to the establishment of the Royal Flying Corps as the Royal Air Force. He's involved in.
He's a big enthusiast for technology, air travel, air power. The South African Air Force, actually one of the older, only established a couple of years after the British Royal Air Force. At some point, I'd love to be on and talk about Adolf Milan, who's one of my favourite people in all of history.
Yeah.
And the torch commando after World War II, but that's another.
Yeah.
Another thing entirely. So that's Smuts' vision. But again, and this comes back in 1922, the British South African companies broke. It's after World War One. The British government is in financial trouble.
Yeah.
And so the British government says to the settlers in Southern Rhodesia, to the South African government under Smuts, and to the British South African company, sort it out amongst yourselves. We will legislate for the results, but whatever happens, we are not paying for any of this. We have we have just enough money to keep Kenya. We don't have enough money to set up a whole new government in the region.
Yeah, one thing I will say is that when you look at the development of the British Empire, you should always remember the people who have the ultimate say of what goes on isn't the army, it isn't the Foreign Office, it's the mandarins in the Treasury saying, you want that, how are you going to pay for it?
Yes, although with the caveat that that's half of the people who are in charge. The other half is just local white people.
Yeah.
And one thing that's very interesting in 1922, well, the reason I became interested in all this in the first place was the same tropes and language we used in the 1922 referendum. Like ideas of Englishness, Britishness, the English language, our relationship to our neighbours, etc., that were used in the 2015 Brexit referendum.
Yeah.
And one other thing that you'll note is that a lot of the major political figures in Britain in Brexit supported Britain remaining in the EU. So it was in 1922. The majority of business leaders, newspaper leaders in Southern Rhodesia, most of the British government wanted Southern Rhodesia to join South Africa as its fifth province.
Yeah.
And the language, particularly notable, the language of the anti-unification party, they talked about like the foreignness of the Afrikaners, their disloyalty to the empire via things such as the Van Rebellion, which was very recent, and also there had been a rebellion in the middle of World War One, which I can't remember the name of off the top of my head.
The Maritz Rebellion in, I think it's September, October 1914.
Yeah, pro-German Republican rebellion, ideas of like Afrikaner disloyalty, Afrikaner foreigners, like the Afrikaans language. Well, Dutch at this, they still call it Dutch at this point.
Yeah,
it's going to become Afrikaans very soon. The idea that Afrikaners aren't actually that white because which was racist, but like one of the interesting things, if you look at the Afrikaner community, is that the idea of Afrikaners as a pure white community is a myth.
Yeah.
They and was a deliberate creation of a myth that was a creation of apartheid.
Mm.
And you also have like people like Esther Jolly, who was a woman who was a legislator in the Southern Rhodesian Assembly, one of the first female legislators in the British Empire, deeply anti-Afrikaner, white supremacist, and she used the language of like motherhood and children.
Yeah.
And like I said, if Southern Rhodesia joined South Africa, it would be an orphan from the mother empire, from the mother country.
Yeah.
And the voters, almost all of them white voters, like apart from like the 10 black voters who existed in 1922, 2/3 of them vote to reject union. The company dissolves the next year. Southern Rhodesia, by this point, about not as many as after World War II. That's another thing entirely. The white population of Southern Rhodesia at this point is about 2% of the population. It grows more and more over the years, becomes self-governing within the British Empire. They're not a dominion like South Africa, Australia, or Canada. They are a self-governing crown colony. Northern Rhodesia, modern Zambia, becomes like a standard extractive crown colony with an appointed governor general. The white settlers there are about 0.1% of the population at this point. They become under London rule, and there's a little territory called Nyasaland, which only becomes part of the British Empire because David Livingstone wanted it to be part of the British Empire. Also becomes a crown colony. There are basically like 10 white people there.
Yeah.
Nyasaland, it exists, becomes modern Malawi, but then it becomes independent. Is backward. Is a backwater. And I don't mean that to degenerate the good people of Malawi. I just mean in terms of like its influence upon the region, it is a backwater. So
I was just going to mention in Nyasaland, Malawi, most of the white settlers who are there are a significant. I should say a significant. There's a certain amount of missionaries there, which is unlike in say Southern Rhodesia or Northern Rhodesia. That there's a particularly Scottish missionaries, if I'm correct, from coming from Livingstone's influence.
Yeah. So again, I just want to pick up some choice quotes from the 1922 referendum. So, Southern Rhodesian politician H.M. Hyman in 1922, in the context, he mentioned the bilingualism in the Natal province and said, quote, "Bilingualism here, which the great majority will not have." And he talked about how in South Africa, republicanism is preached openly and defiantly, secessionism is accepted. And another Southern Rhodesian, who was, as far as I can tell, an Afrikaner himself, there was an Afrikaner community there, referred to Dutchmen being instigated by hatred and narrow nationalism, desiring a one-sided republic. And you sort of have, and you also have later on the rhetoric in the press talking about primitive Afrikaner farmers, and like they use the same sort of language as the primitive Afrikaner farmers on the one hand, and then they talk about black farmers who have much to learn about agriculture. So there's sort of like a line in the press rhetoric being drawn between white Afrikaners in 1922 as sort of like primitive and backwards versus and black Africans being condemned in the same way. And then you have the language of the poor whites, the hungry hordes. So this is another area which I think a lot of people really interesting talking about Southern Rhodesia is the relationship between class and identity in white Southern Rhodesians. White South Africans in 1922 and now, there are a lot of them. Even nowadays, about 8% of the white South African, 8% of the population of South Africa is white. At this point, it was about 12%, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. And white South Africans, every strata of the class structure, from business magnates down to poor farmers, down to day labourers in the cities.
Yeah.
And this really changes the dynamic of politics in South Africa. You have a white Labour movement, you have a white Liberal movement, you have a white Conservative movement, and so you have the white Labour movement in South Africa is really protective of its privileges.
Yeah.
In Southern Rhodesia, that ends up happening, but only later on. At this point in 1922, the majority of white South Africans are middle-class farmers.
Yeah.
And there's sort of like a myth of white Rhodesians as sort of like layabouts, which isn't accurate.
Yeah.
That's Kenya. White Kenyans were layabouts. The ideal, like one thing you see consistently as I'll try and bring up the exact quote. There was it's buried in my thesis, but it was a really evocative quote that sort of the Minister for Agriculture basically said later on, we want people who will work.
Yeah.
And they wanted people not just maintain racial power, the white racial power. That's an ugly turn of phrase, accurate in the colony. They also wanted people to maintain the class system.
Yeah.
White middle class people owning farms, owning businesses, working farms, etc. And so I think that brings us on to what if Southern Rhodesia joined South Africa in 1922? I think, first of all, a lot more white immigration a lot sooner to what is now the province of Southern Rhodesia. Secondly, I think the earlier establishment of strict racial segregation in land, which happened in OTL in 1930, in land and in employment. Thirdly, I think South Africa, international politics are more mainstream within the British Empire.
Yeah.
Fourthly, I don't think the butterflies of this would prevent things like the rise of fascism or World War II, frankly.
No. I think the big changes internationally come sort of post World War II, more than pre-war.
Yes. And do you want to?
Oh yeah, I was just saying. One of the big butterflies within South Africa that we should talk about it during the interwar period would be on Smuts' political career. What I'm thinking of is let's say we take the counterfactual. This Southern Rhodesia becomes a part of South Africa as the fifth province.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of their parliamentary representation,
I have this somewhere in here. Give me a moment.
Okay, if I just set up the sort of South African political situation at that point, and then when you can bring up your source. You had the Rand rebellion earlier in 1922, which was because of the gold mining in White Witwatersrand.
Mm-hmm.
The price of gold had gone down, so the owners were reducing wages and were relaxing the rules to allow some black workers into skilled roles, and that provoked a backlash among the labour movement in South Africa. Both the Labour Party and also the Communist Party have the infamous phrase, "Workers of the world unite for a white South Africa." I believe that's the phrase they use during the Rand Rebellion.
Yes.
Smuts, who is Prime Minister, puts this down quite strongly using considerable force, using South African Defence the Union Defence Force, I believe that's the phrase. And this has a knock-on effect that the National Party, which is the Afrikaner party, they're very good at ones that lean towards republicanism and nationalism, and the South African Labour Party join forces, and they're able to defeat Smuts's party, then the South Africa Party, or the South African Party, and they form a coalition government. And so I've mentioned with this counterfactual, with the Rhodesian parliamentary representation, I would imagine that the Rhodesians are more likely to align with Smuts's party than they would with, say, the National Party or
with Milan. Yeah. PF Milan at this point.
Yeah, and that may lead to Smuts remaining in power as Prime Minister far longer into the 20s and 30s than he actually did, because he loses power in, it's 24, isn't it, that general election, which brings
sorry, I'm having a brain fart. No, it was Herzog who succeeded him in 24, and Milan succeeded him in 48. Right, but yeah. Barry Herzog, they wouldn't support Herzog. Like the sort of pro-British Crown Afrikaners like Botha and Smuts would have gotten white Rhodesian support. And I think one of the sort of, again, it all comes back to those two questions.
Yeah.
Like Smuts was a lifelong segregationist.
Yeah.
He opposed apartheid mostly on the grounds he thought it was kind of like impractical, on the grounds that South Africa was already too mixed.
Yeah.
But he was a white supremacist, and like again, very few people weren't white supremacists in South Africa at this point.
Yeah.
Now, and how can I put this? I don't see too much domestic change in Southern Rhodesia or South Africa generally because of this. And Anglophone South African ended up opposing apartheid. Well, not all, again, most of them didn't. And a lot of the reasons they did was that that apartheid introduced after 1948 was Afrikaner nationalist in a way that was explicitly anti-British.
Yeah.
So after 1948, you start seeing reforms to the Union Defence Force, reforms to education, etc., that emphasise Afrikanerdom over Anglo-Afrikaner unity.
Yeah.
So what I think one of the more interesting ways, particularly after World War II, decolonisation starts mostly on schedule.
Yeah.
Your cat is running around like a lunatic behind you.
Yeah, he does that occasionally.
I sympathise. As someone who also runs around like a lunatic occasionally, I do sympathise. So one of the things I think you'll see. By the way, that picture of Smuts is very distracting because he looks like he's staring into my soul.
Do you want to? I'll take it down if you want to.
Yeah, please and thank you. It's just like piercing gaze of Jan Smuts looking at me through history. So I'm torn actually. So does the National Party win in 1948 with this? No, I don't think. I think Smuts wins again in 1948, United Party victory. Now the interesting questions start to begin, because I think by this point, you still have things like segregation in employment and in land introduced in Southern Rhodesia, that only as part of South Africa rather than as part of the empire. Now, I think what ends up happening is perhaps not grand apartheid, But imperial segregation was a thing within the empire and within South Africa.
Yeah.
And I think further restrictions along those lines are likely. And I think what you end up with is a government whose ideology is more similar to Smith's Rhodesia Front
Yeah.
than it is to Milan's Grand Apartheid Project. And I think it will go out of its way to be less alienating towards the British and global sensibilities.
Yeah.
And perhaps might go out of its way to be less alienating towards the Indian South African and coloured South African population.
Mm.
But one which is still committed to white supremacy as a whole.
Yeah.
And I think it might buy itself a few years just simply by being less deliberately odious.
Mm.
But that's not saying much.
No, I mean, without apartheid, it's a lot easier for, say, Britain and the United States to continue to support this version of South Africa during the Cold War, where you would have criticism of it, obviously, back in the UK and the US, but it wouldn't have the examples to show to make things more difficult in terms of international support.
Yeah, I think there's part of that. I also think this regime having a more Anglophone face would make that easier.
Yeah.
The extent to which the apartheid regime in the early period went out of its way to antagonize Anglophone opinion, yeah, is something. Having said that, I think I don't think, for example, you would have the Cape coloured crisis where the apartheid government tried to remove Cape qualified coloured voters from the franchise in the Cape.
Yeah, I could just bear with me a second. I've just got to sort something out too.
That's all right.
Crazy, stop messing. Over there. Sorry, he's messing about with something. Sorry about that. He was messing.
Yeah, cats do what cats do. Again, the tension is, though, you will have a government that's not going to do what the apartheid government did, but that's a commentary on the extreme radicalism of apartheid.
Yeah.
More than it is a commentary on the liberalism of white Southern Rhodesians.
Yeah.
Which was there were some like Garfield Todd.
Yeah.
But a pro-British, pro-segregationist, white supremacist, populist party is not that much of an improvement.
Yeah.
And if you're a black civil rights leader, it doesn't matter if the guy beating you with a stick is doing so in the name of Afrikaner republicanism or in the name of British civilization.
Yeah.
And I think when you study this period, both in terms of history and in exploring it in alternate history, the sort of paths to a liberal democratic South Africa are narrow, because a lot of the sort of your options end up being Afrikaner Republican white supremacist or British loyalist white supremacist. Now, there were liberals such as Hofmeyr. I mean, Hofmeyr's whole thing was like, South Africa, we can't continue enforcing segregation on people who are attending universities. Who I've read speeches by him saying, like it or not, Black Africans are joining trade unions, are getting educations. We must reform our system to include them, or we will rebel against him.
Yeah.
He basically worked himself to death in World War II. He was dead by 1948.
Mm.
If he hadn't been, he would have most certainly been party leader of the United Party by this point. And then you had like people like Adolf Milan, who I mentioned earlier, saying the National Party project is fascism, both in both ideology and outlook and in practice. And I didn't spend 6 years of my life in the RAF just to see it re-emerge in South Africa.
Yeah.
In a timeline where the National Party don't come to power in 48, someone like Milan, when he had Parkinson's, it started developing after World War II. If he doesn't have that, maybe he ends up in the liberal dissident wing of the United Party.
Yeah.
But I think if the Angolan, Mozambique, like rebel go up as they did in OTL against Portuguese rule, the Congo crisis happens in OTL, I think you end up with the white population of South Africa radicalizing much as the white population of Southern Rhodesia did. I think what you end up happening is sort of like, rather than apartheid creating a security state, which then creates the reign of terror that apartheid basically was, I think you end up with sort of much as happened in Rhodesia before UDI, crackdowns on groups like the ANC, the establishment of a security state, and you end up in a similar place by different means, and it happens a bit later. So rather than 1948, everything starts cracking down because like apartheid is introduced, I think you end up with basically a pre-war status quo continuing up until the 60s, and then the hammer starts coming down.
Yeah.
Because the white population have gone out of their fucking minds.
Yeah. Yeah. I do wonder, do you think there would have been an element that may have become prominent on that sort of distant wing of the United Party that like the two gentlemen you previously mentioned, that might have come into prominence in the 70s as saying that majority rule is coming. The only way we can is to come to terms with it and try and make sure that we have a role in South Africa post once majority rule takes place.
Like again, it's one of those things where optimistically I would like to say it's a possibility.
Yeah.
See, let's say, South Africa, Southern Rhodesia joins, things are much the same. 1948 is when things start to diverge in the region because the United Party wins. Okay, United Party wins. The problem is in OTL, like Hofmeyr is dead. Let's say he takes a vacation in World War II and it's Hofmeyr leading the United Party in 1948. And his program is gradual reform, like expand the Cape franchise, maybe include more educated Black Africans, Indians, coloured people in our political system, yeah? Start maybe easing up some of the segregation of jobs.
Yeah.
That's a possibility, and it might slowly progress through late after 48, in through the 50s, 60s, so on and so forth. That's the optimistic standpoint. Now, there are two issues with this. Now, if he rushes it, there's going to be a white backlash.
Yes.
Much like happened to Garfield Todd in Rhodesia in the 50s, whose proposal to, I think, give about 8,000 Black Africans the vote was too radical.
Yeah.
And he was kicked out of office, then became a critic of both Smith and then later on Mugabe.
Yeah.
Or it's gradual enough to be accepted by white South Africans across the region. On the other hand, though, is it gradual? Yes, but is it still happening enough to meet the acceptance of the ANC?
Yeah.
And do a bunch of Indian shopkeepers get in the vote in Natalia? What does that mean to a black miner on the Witwatersrand?
Yeah.
I know. So, like, a white farmer in Southern Rhodesia has the vote. Netalian Indian shopkeeper has the vote. Okay, but I'm still down here choking on coal dust.
Yeah.
or what does it mean that my language is being replaced by English and Afrikaans, and I'm not getting an education in that language, apart from, maybe a few hours at home every day?
Yeah.
Like, and I think a lot of the discussion about like the sort of alternate history of South Africa in this period, like, Black Africans will have a say on this.
Yeah.
And again, in the context of the Cold War, like, the Soviets are taking an interest, and then later on the Chinese will be taking an interest. I think there is a path, like, I think like post-war, Southern Rhodesia having adjoined makes it more likely you end up with basically a sort of convergent, if distinct, Anglo-apartheid.
Yeah.
But it does leave a better chance for reform, like liberal reforms over the 50s and 60s. But I think there's also something to consider that with the death of people, like early death of Hofmeyr, early death of Milan, and the sort of, in OTL, there was a split between the radicals who joined, like white radicals who ended up joining the ANC, like Joe Slovo, ended up becoming communists, and the white liberals who, while opposing the National Party, weren't communists.
Yeah.
Again, it all depends on reaction and reactions to reactions, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, like, to give an example from NTL, Joseph Nkomo was one of the founders of the South African National Congress, and later became a guerrilla leader because his original thing was about education and voting reform.
Yeah.
That's what the SR ANC was driving for in the 50s, was just, we want more resources for Black African education, and then once we have that education, we would like the vote, please.
Yeah.
The Southern Rhodesian government banned it. And then he's like, fuck it. If they're just going to ban us for doing that, we're going to take up arms.
Yeah.
And it all depends on, like, again, like, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it deserves to be repeated. Like, well, to give it something we've seen on Twitter recently, this whole nonsense about Haitians eating pets in Ohio.
Yeah.
That sort of mad, stupid rhetoric was commonplace in the white community in Southern Rhodesia and in South Africa.
Yeah.
About Black Africans, because they thought a lot about Black Africans and what they were doing, without ever actually really, like, taking any concern into what they actually felt and thought.
Yeah.
And I'm torn between sort of, like, yes, the possibility of gradual liberal reform in the 50s and 60s, and the reality was of the sort of, like, paranoia of the white community in those countries. And one of the things Nelson Mandela did, like, in OTL, even when he was in prison, was to build connections with the white opposition, such as, well, of course, there were white guerrillas such as Joe Slovo and Ruth First, but also with the white parliamentary opposition, such as Helen Zuzman and Harry Schwartz a bit later on. And he's like, and to build the ideology of, yes, South Africa, white South Africans can be South African, as opposed to things like the Azanian people, the Azanian Congress or Azania Party, who were black nationalists, exclusionists. So it's one of the, I guess, my ultimate conclusion would be, what if Southern Rhodesia joined South Africa in 1922? Well, South Africa continues as a white Anglo-Afrikaner segregationist place. Afrikaner nationalism is less of a force because of pro-British white Southern Rhodesians.
Yeah.
White supremacy remains a thing. Then after World War II is when the new possibilities start arising.
Yeah.
One thing I will say is that there is the possibility that South Africa ends up with a larger white population.
Yeah, because post-war immigration as well be a part of that. Post-war white immigration will be a part of that.
Yes, but also I think a lot of white Southern Rhodesians also don't want mass white immigration.
Yeah.
Because whereas the Afrikaners don't want it because of cultural reasons, white Southern Rhodesians don't want it because of class reasons.
Yeah.
But they might be willing to say, okay, yeah, we're happy with white immigration to the rest of South Africa, just not so much to here.
Yeah.
And again, does that make racial segregation more or less of a powerful force? If by 1955, 20% of South Africa in this timeline is white, are they more or less protective of their racial privileges?
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned before I joined, I wrote a timeline like South Africa becomes a liberal democracy in the 60s. I put that's my novel, or Free and Happy Land. And two things about that. I had like an 18-step program to get to the point where that was possible.
Yeah.
This included dissolving Belgium and the South African Civil War.
Oh, yeah, that's some steps.
Because I needed the international situation, the local situation in the region, and the situation in South Africa to the point where white South Africans of like a moderate strain would be more willing to accept black enfranchisement than they would be to accept the nationalist Grand Apartheid project.
Yeah.
And the thing is, in OTL, the moderates were more willing to accept Grand Apartheid than they were to accept political reform.
Yeah.
And again, if you look at the rhetoric that was coming from the national, one thing that strikes me about the 1948 election in particular, the United Party did not run a good campaign. One, the National Party ran an effective campaign basically based on racial fear-mongering.
Yeah.
The third point was that, I think something that the existing issue, South Africa was very gerrymandered before 1948.
Yeah.
In favour of rural seats. Now, in 1922, I think the United Party wins in 48 in this new timeline because of white Southern Rhodesians being opposed to National Party issue, just for reasons already discussed. But that doesn't change the sort of mush the United Party has become.
Yeah.
Now, a conservative pro-empire party with a liberal wing makes sense in 38, but by 1948, it's the era of Labour wins its New Jerusalem. Labour's focused on domestic issues. India has become independent. I don't know if this timeline, maybe India has become independent as united, or it's still partition has happened. Regardless, India, Pakistan, whatever, has become independent. Australia and Canada are even now looking to the United States.
Yeah.
Britain is like the Cold War is starting. What does the Conservative United Party project look like after 1948 as a government in power?
Yeah.
And the status quo, maybe some small economic reforms like integrating some people into the. I think it's not going to be enough for the Black Africans, certainly.
Yeah.
At least at the pace that was proposed in 1948. But also, I think it might be too radical for the white population.
Yeah.
And Smuts doesn't have that much longer to live. And then you have a gap because Hofmeyr is dead. And you have people like Gideon Strauss who might take over, or I can't remember his.
Graf.
Well, there was, yeah. So you have
I'm just going to tell you.
De Villiers Graf, who was the leader of the United Party in the latter part of the 50s. You had Strauss, who was the leader of this United Party after Smuts. And basically, I think Strauss's political project was white leadership with just recognition of non-European aspiration.
Yeah.
Which is, and he opposed like the Suppression of Communism Act, which in South African context, communism was defined as whatever the government didn't like.
Yeah.
To the point where one judge later described it as, quote, statutory communism. So that like Strauss was like, yeah, we white supremacism, but black people get to have opinions too.
Yeah.
Which again, better than apartheid, but like people want votes, people want jobs, people want decent housing.
Yeah, it's not a solution to the problem. It's a recognition that there is a problem, but not
refusing to recognise that the solution is the vote, jobs, healthcare, education.
Yeah.
And I think Southern Rhodesian membership of South Africa enables that sort of rhetoric to exist for a while longer.
Yeah.
But eventually something has to give one way or another. I think, much like OTL, within, I think, a context of South Africa is less internationally isolated.
Yeah.
But I don't think less international isolation could fundamentally change. Well, let's say 20, like a white minority cannot rule South Africa forever.
No.
Either the white minority rule ends or South Africa ends.
Yeah. One thing I would like to, if you got more to say on this, I'm have to go on. But I'd like to. Oh, sorry.
No, if you think of winding down, we've been at this for nearly 2 hours. So
yeah, if we stay on for another 15 minutes, but we let's say we discuss what might happen to Northern Rhodesia and Bechuanaland, which are respectively now in Zambia and Botswana.
Okay, now that's really.
Oh, sorry.
That's very interesting. So Bechuanaland, Botswana. Now, deeply poor place.
Yeah.
Botswana prosperity emerges after World War II because they have an extremely talented leadership. And also they find diamonds and they use that responsibly.
Yeah.
Before that, no one gave a shit about the area. There was some white farmers who had some degree of, in like the northwest of the territory, had some degree of political aspirations. Maybe that area is like annexed to this new expanded South Africa. Maybe not. And it all comes. Now, this is the point where the British government actually does have a part to play in the story. We haven't mentioned the Metropolitan government. In 1930, they published a white paper basically saying the interests of the natives are paramount in the British East Africa. And British East Africa did include Northern Rhodesia, Kenya, etc., etc., etc. And this happened basically simultaneously with the discovery of massive amounts of copper in Northern Rhodesia. And copper mining became a mainstay of the Northern Rhodesian and then post-independence Zambian economies.
Yeah.
Also inspired a minor settler boom in Northern Rhodesia. Nowhere near to the same extent as like the gold rushes or in the Witwatersrand, but the white population in Northern Rhodesia went from like 0.1% of the population to 1% of the population.
Yeah.
And they had their own political aspirations, but they were not self-governing, unlike South Rhodesia and OTL, unlike expanded dominion in this timeline.
Yeah.
And I think this could be an interesting point of conflict Because one of the things you'll read in the sources from like this in OTL, I obviously I can't read sources from alternate history. I'm good, but I'm not that good. Is Whitehall like officials becoming increasingly frustrated of white Northern Rhodesians acting like they're a Dominion.
Yeah.
And also increasingly worried about the lack of control Whitehall, London has over white Southern Rhodesians, and becoming increasingly aware that these systems of segregation that are practiced in South Africa and Southern Rhodesia at this point are unpopular.
Yeah.
Amongst Black Rhodesians, Black South Africans. And one thing you'll note if you read like government reports is like whenever we in London go out and ask Black Africans what they think of their systems in their colonies, they were like, we really don't like the segregation of land and employment.
Yeah.
Much more so than the demand for the vote. It was, we want fair access to land and we want fair access to jobs.
Yeah, because if you can, if you got a wage coming in and you've got food on the table, a vote is something up there where they are material things that you can grab hold of.
Exactly, yes. And let's say, I don't think this changes if Southern Rhodesia joins South Africa. I think one thing I think the Afrikaner community will be able to push back on if Southern Rhodesia does join South Africa is further Anglophone expansion.
Yeah.
And I think you might end up with sort of a weird sort of like de facto alliance between Whitehall officials not wanting South Africa to expand anymore and Afrikaner nationalists not wanting South Africa to expand anymore.
Yeah.
And you, I think, also might start seeing in this timeline before and after World War II, particularly after World War II, an increased. One of the interesting things that happens in Northern Rhodesia is the copper mines employ Black and white people equally.
Yeah.
Or not just numbers, but in terms of like skills-based employment. And a lot of education for Black Africans is done by the mining companies on a more egalitarian and fairer basis for practical reasons, basically.
Yeah.
And I think in this timeline, I think you might see a bigger contrast between colonial practice in Northern Rhodesia in terms of education versus education and employment in Greater South Africa, as we might call this new dominion. Yeah. But of course, all within the context of colonial rule and all the inequalities inherent therein. What I will also note, I think, however, white Northern Rhodesians in this new context might themselves desire union with South Africa, but they're not going to be given it.
Yeah.
There's nowhere near enough to justify turning Northern Rhodesia into a province of South Africa.
Yeah.
I think, again, everything really depends on what happens after World War II.
Yeah.
And the shifts and changes therein.
And let's say we've got a situation where you've got the Greater South Africa, you've got Northern Rhodesia still as a British colony. You hit 1960, directly north of Northern Rhodesia is the Congo, and you've got the issue in Katanga, and that all kicks off into.
And that's where I was talking about the white radicalization might come in. Because one thing that radicalized white communities, white Southern Rhodesians, was white refugees coming over the border.
Yeah.
And if Southern Rhodesia is part of South Africa and part of the same media political system, does that mean a Anglo-African European front wins in South Africa in 1960?
Yeah.
Sort of a hybrid between the National Party and the Rhodesia Front. Which is less blatantly Afrikaner nationalist, but more blatantly white supremacist.
Yeah.
Or white protectionist, if you might call it.
Yeah.
That's my concern, and that's my sort of like thinking about that. Like, what is the system that arises then? I think, again, there's the optimistic take and there's pessimistic take.
Yeah.
Of white-led liberal reform that eventually leads to the universal franchise and, you know, a government under Mandela or Sambo or not fucking
Turbo and Becky.
yeah. Oh no, Phoebe Mbeki comes later. I mean,
Oliver
at this Oliver
Tambo.
Tambo, yeah, under them, or does it lead to, well, you know, Ian Smith, Prime Minister of South Africa?
Yeah.
And I think, sadly, that Ian Smith, Prime Minister of South Africa, is more likely in this timeline. Because one thing that I will say, as we just sort of like, I am get very hungry right now.
Okay, yeah.
One thing I will say is that one of the interesting parts of the Smith regime in Rhodesia and OGL was that it marked sort of like a reconciliation between white Anglo-Rhodesians and white Afrikaner-Rhodesians.
Yeah.
Basically, what happened in Rhodesia in the 60s was basically what happened in South Africa in the 30s. The sort of rise to dominance of the white labour movement.
Yeah.
And the Rhodesia Front was a white populist party, a white Labour party, much more than the Rhodesia Party, the Rhodesian United Party had been, which had been a conservative pro-empire party.
Yeah.
I don't really have. I do have more to. I would love to talk about like Milan and the Torch Commando, and sort of like and things like that. But those are generally my thoughts on the question posed by this and border history.
We'll wrap it up there then. But we'll have. We'll definitely. I'd love to have you on again to discuss Milan and the things you mentioned.
And I would also more broadly like ideas such as gender and policing and sort of like one of the things I sort of like hit at before, sort of like the sort of deliberate ignorance of the white settlers towards their black African subjects.
Yeah. Yeah, I should say that linked in the description is your article on the 1922 referendum, and I would recommend anybody to read it because it's really interesting.
Thank you, and it's open. You don't have to pay for it. You don't have to sign up for it. It is open access. I really hope people read that and have a look. See, is there a link I can, once will this be? I know obviously this is a live stream. Is there a recording of this I can give out to people, post on my social media?
Oh yeah, if you just go onto my YouTube channel, you can just copy a link of it and send it out, or I can send you a link.
Please send me a link, and then.
I should also say that in the description as well are Charlton's 2 books and links to the 2 collection short stories that he has short stories in. Amazon links in the description below.
And Aaron, is it Aaron? That's how.
Yeah, that's how you
said. Aaron, been a genuine pleasure tonight. Thank you very much. Always love talking about this sort of stuff, and love talking about Africa, Southern Africa, and it's the beautiful countries, beautiful regions, and beautiful people.
Yeah, and sorry.
Thank you, Elo. So thank you for having me.
Oh, it's quite right. And thank you for coming on. It has been really interesting. And I should say that by any chance, have you read Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad?
Years ago, but yes.
Oh, right. It's just because on Thursday, me and my friend Sean are going to be doing a discussion of it. So if you want to, listen in on that, you're more than welcome. My mate Sean is really interested in African history, It would have been interesting to have him on here to talk to you, because he had read a hell of a lot about South African history as well. It'd be fascinating for the two of you to hit off with you, to sort of talk about this stuff as well.
I like that. Okay, thank you once again, and have a lovely evening, Aaron.
Have a good evening as well. Bye.
Oh, well.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will say goodbye, and I will see you in terms of live streams on Thursday at 6 p.m, where me and Sean will be discussing The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. With that, I'll say goodbye, and I will see you later.